The train wheels clattered against frozen tracks as Franz Rohrbach pressed his face to the frosted window, watching the endless Russian steppe roll past. It was March 1942, and the 20-year-old Austrian conscript was heading toward a destiny that would transform him from an idealistic soldier into a survivor of one of history's most catastrophic battles. His journey from the training grounds to the ruins of Stalingrad, and ultimately through 5 years of Soviet captivity, would strip away every illusion about war's glory. Franz had been loaded onto the military train in Wels, Austria, with hundreds of other young men destined for the 100th Jäger Division. After a week of cramped travel, they arrived in Nikopol in the Donbass region, where the division was being hastily organized. For 2 weeks, Franz trained as a messenger, a melder, learning to navigate battlefields while carrying vital communications between units. He couldn't know that this role would both save and nearly destroy him in the months ahead. His baptism of fire came on May 17, 1942, during the German offensive near Kharkov. As Franz's unit advanced across the open steppe, Soviet artillery erupted in response. The earth heaved, throwing men and equipment skyward. When the barrage paused, a desperate scream pierced the smoke. "Sanitator! Help!" Beside Franz lay a comrade, his leg severed at the thigh, blood pooling in the Ukrainian soil. The sight paralyzed Franz. This boy who'd shared cigarettes with him just hours before was now dying in agony. Franz nearly fainted, suddenly understanding that death stood merely inches away, ready to claim him just as randomly. That evening, tasked with reporting the regiment's capture of the village of Chapel, Franz stumbled upon fresh graves marked with birch crosses. Each bore a name, his peers from the 3rd Battalion, boys he'd trained with in Austria. They'd died during a surprise night attack by Soviet tanks. Franz photographed the makeshift cemetery, a tangible reminder of mortality that he'd carry through the war. During these early operations, Franz's limited Polish proved unexpectedly valuable. While escorting a captured Soviet soldier suspected of being a commissar, identifiable by his leather boots, which meant certain execution under Wehrmacht orders, Franz began conversing with the prisoner. As they passed a peasant house, an elderly couple emerged, making desperate gestures toward the captive. "Do you know them?" Franz asked. "They're my parents," the commissar replied quietly. Franz faced a moment that would define his humanity amid inhumanity. A man would be shot simply for wearing boots, executed before his parents' eyes. When they reached headquarters, Franz saw 200 Soviet prisoners sitting on the grass. Making a split-second decision, he told the commissar to sit among them and reported only that he'd brought a prisoner, omitting the fatal detail about suspected commissar status. Perhaps he saved a life that day. He'd never know for certain. The 54th Jäger Regiment reached Stalingrad on September 25, 1942, approaching the infamous Mamayev Kurgan from the south. They spent the next day digging in, enjoying an eerie quiet, the calm before the storm. On September 27th, orders came to storm Height 102.0, what the Soviets called Mamayev Kurgan, and German maps labeled Totenhöhe, Death Height. The assault began at dawn. Despite continuous attacks supported by Stuka dive bombers and 6-barreled Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, Franz's unit only reached the hill's midpoint by nightfall. The Soviet positions, pulverized by 150mm rockets that left smoke trails across the sky, somehow continued resistance. Only on the second evening did they finally capture the summit. Franz would later witness the Soviet response, Katyusha rockets that screamed across the sky in devastating barrages. But that would come later, when his unit was trapped in the Stalingrad cauldron. For now, they held the height that would change hands repeatedly in the coming months. The cost was catastrophic. Franz's 7th Company had attacked with over 80 men. By the evening of September 28th, when they finally secured Mamayev Kurgan, only 12 remained alive. They discovered this during dinner distribution when their cook arrived with a thermos of hot food, miraculously still warm despite bullet holes hastily plugged with breadcrumbs. The cook began ladling rice porridge, cooked with milk, a delicacy for soldiers who hadn't eaten in 24 hours. After filling 12 mess tins, he paused, looking at the still half-full thermos. "Where are the others?" he asked. "There are no others," someone replied. The cook stared at the container he'd risked his life to bring forward, then put his hands on his head and wept. The battle settled into positional warfare. German and Soviet trenches lay 250 meters apart, close enough to observe the enemy without binoculars. Snipers made movement lethal during daylight. As a messenger, Franz learned safe routes between positions, paths invisible to enemy marksmen. Death waited for the careless or unlucky. After one fierce Soviet counterattack pushed them back 150 meters, they waited for darkness to retrieve their dead from no man's land. Strangely, when they ventured out, the Soviets illuminated them with searchlights, but held their fire. Whether from ammunition shortage or allowing enemies to honor their dead, Franz never knew. Eventually relieved at Mamayev Kurgan, Franz's unit relocated to a small wood west of Stalingrad, nicknamed Blumentopf, flower pot. They barely had time to bathe before being thrown north toward the Red October factory, where fighting reached new levels of intensity. Daily attacks against Soviet positions that seemed carved from the earth itself bled their companies white. With casualties mounting, even specialized personnel like messengers were pressed into frontline combat. They established a rotation, 2 days in the trenches, 2 days resting in the flower pot, where they could shave, bathe, and briefly feel human again. By November 10th, Franz's body rebelled. His right leg went numb and wouldn't bend properly. The next day, he evacuated to a medical station where Dr. Ellinger examined him. Rashes covered his body. His shins were masses of infected blisters. The diagnosis, near septic infection, requiring immediate hospitalization. Franz received the coveted Heimatschuss, a ticket home via injury. He began packing eagerly until an older comrade intervened. "Franz, do what you want, but I wouldn't go. First, Christmas is coming with packages from home. We'll have to eat your share without you. Second, after hospitalization, you won't return to us, but get assigned elsewhere." Against all logic, Franz declined evacuation. Dr. Ellinger, astonished, prescribed complete bed rest at the front. Franz was billeted with a 73-year-old Russian woman and her 9-year-old granddaughter. He called the woman Matka, mother, and acted as big brother to the child. When the girl saw him struggling outside to use the latrine, she'd pelt him with snowballs. During these moments, playing like children, the war temporarily vanished. This respite lasted 1 week. Then came encirclement. The Stalingrad cauldron snapped shut. Food rations immediately dwindled. Their unit, using horses rather than vehicles for transport, initially maintained meat supplies by slaughtering their draft animals. But soon, even horses were memories, and without them, they couldn't even haul firewood to the trenches. On January 15th, 1943, the unit clerk, desperate for heating fuel for headquarters, ordered the bedridden Franz to find a horse and sledge for wood collection. When Franz protested his illness, the clerk, a Feldwebel outranking Franz's Gefreiter status, assigned him to a punishment company at the front. Despite his friend Paul's urging to apologize, Franz refused to grovel. He packed his few possessions, bid farewell to the Russian woman and child who'd shown him kindness, and returned to the Red October factory on January 26th. A massive snowstorm raged that day as Soviet tanks attacked. Visibility dropped to mere meters. Franz's unit burrowed into snowdrifts as tanks rumbled past, unseeing in the whiteout. They lost their field kitchen in the assault. No more hot food. 2 days later, nighttime brought the drone of Luftwaffe transport planes, invisible in the darkness and snow. A heavy thud nearby revealed a supply container. Franz retrieved 7 cans of meat stew, hiding them in nearby ruins. He decided he wouldn't surrender until he'd consumed them all. By January 30th, military organization had dissolved. No more companies or battalions, just scattered groups of frost-bitten, starving men. Forced back toward the central station, they received orders to defend house ruins. Military units typically maintained contact with forces on their flanks. Franz's group had nobody left on either side. At 11 a.m., Franz observed Soviets preparing to attack. Mortars began their deadly song. To his right, he saw 200 to 300 German soldiers raising white fabric on sticks, walking toward Soviet lines. But Franz, still possessing 5 cans of stew, wasn't ready to surrender. Sepp Hintermüller from Linz chose to remain with him. They sprinted for a small ravine 100 meters away, Franz zigzagging as bullets cracked past. His glove fell off. He didn't stop. Stopping meant death. They tumbled into the ravine together. "I think the war is over for us," Franz gasped. Making their way toward the station, they discovered a shelter in a large gully, a dugout with fireplace and wood. Its owner, a mechanized regiment Feldwebel from central Stalingrad, invited them to stay. They prepared their last supper: heated stew, coffee beans ground with an axe, and peaceful sleep. Dawn brought surreal revelation. Franz pulled back the entrance canvas to find 20 Soviet tanks meters away. He discarded his machine gun. Weapons were pointless now. Inexplicably, nobody fired. The tanks simply waited in eerie silence. The Feldwebel went to check his unit. Around 11 a.m., he returned reporting final rations being distributed. He grabbed mess tins and left again. Nearby, Franz spotted a Wehrmacht field kitchen operating behind a truck, just 20 meters from Soviet tanks. German soldiers queued for food while enemy armor watched. Realizing they'd get nothing if they delayed, Franz joined the queue, filled their tins, and returned safely. It was the Wehrmacht's last meal. The Feldwebel returned again, explaining he was his company commander's driver and needed advice on destroying their vehicle. Hammer the engine or grenade it? "Do nothing," Franz advised. "We'll drive to captivity." They crossed a log bridge Wehrmacht engineers had built months earlier, carefully avoiding German soldiers walking the same direction. No white flags were needed. Everyone understood the war had ended for them. At the ravine's far edge, Red Army soldiers waited. A young Soviet officer called "Stoy" and vaulted into their vehicle. Reaching a road, he ordered them out. "You go that direction now," then drove away with their Feldwebel. Franz and Hintermüller joined the prisoner columns. Being among the last to surrender, they found nearby camps full and were marched deeper into Soviet territory. 6 days and nights under open sky followed. They marched by day, collapsed wherever they stopped at night, using knapsacks as pillows and blankets as covers. The temperature reached -25°C, not the -40 often claimed, but sufficient to kill. Many who began the march never reached prison camps, dying of cold and exhaustion. The Soviets, overwhelmed by prisoner numbers, managed only one meal in 6 days, a few bread crusts. Hintermüller weakened rapidly. "Come morning, I won't get up," he declared one night. "I can't continue." "We go forward at dawn," Franz insisted. "Fall on the road and they'll shoot you." Franz's survival instinct drove him to collect anything combustible during marches. Finding cord, he'd bundle wood chips to drag along. At night, halts, he'd build fires, melting snow for water in his mess tin. One night, Hintermüller went to relieve himself and never returned. Franz adapted ruthlessly, taking blankets from the dead. Soon he had 3. One night he dug a snow hole, laid one blanket beneath him, covered himself with 2 others, and slept until noon. Waking, he discovered a Croatian soldier had joined him under the blankets. Their column had departed. Fear spiked. Soviet guards would shoot escapees on sight. Fortunately, a new prisoner group appeared. Franz and the Croat joined them, continuing their death march. The prison camp at Beketovka was ravaged by typhus. The epidemic had begun before Stalingrad's fall, and now consumed prisoners like wildfire. Franz's luck held. He discovered a separate house for German officers with its own bath facility. Though ordinary soldiers were banned, Franz sneaked into the anteroom to wash, using breadcrumbs to make primitive soap. A week later, the door opened, revealing Sepp Hintermüller, alive but barely. He'd fainted that night on the march. While unconscious, others stole his boots. He'd wrapped his feet in blanket scraps to continue, but frostbite had turned them black. Hintermüller died soon after their reunion. Later transferred to a camp near Volsk, 900 kilometers from Stalingrad, Franz joined thousands suffering from dystrophy. One by one they entered the hospital. There, miracle awaited: baths, clean clothes, metal beds with white linen. Heaven on earth, Franz thought. His third-degree dystrophy qualified him for white bread, a life-saving privilege. Franz Rohrbach survived 4 years and 8 months in Soviet captivity. Of the 91,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 returned home. Franz was among these few, his survival a testament to adaptability, ruthless pragmatism, and simple luck. His memoir reveals war's reality, not glory, but grinding survival, not heroism, but desperate choices. From that young soldier, photographing his dead comrades' graves, to the skeletal survivor returning to Austria in 1947, Franz's journey traces the arc from illusion to truth. In Stalingrad's ruins, Nazi Germany's ambitions died alongside countless soldiers who learned too late that war consumes victors and vanquished alike. Franz's story endures as testimony that survival sometimes demands abandoning everything except the will to see another dawn, even when that dawn rises over captivity rather than victory. In the frozen hellscape of Stalingrad, humanity's extremes met. Cruelty and kindness, desperation and endurance, death and the stubborn refusal to surrender to it.